Let's cross to correspondent Kethevane Gorjestani. Kethevane, I say Washington, but in fact you're in Virginia.
Yes, I'm in Virginia by the Pentagon, which of course was one of the three sites of those 9/11 attacks. That plane that crashed in the west side of the Pentagon, killing 184 people here on the site. And of course, this is also a day of remembrance here for the people who work inside this Pentagon. And the ceremonies actually began earlier this morning at sunrise, the way they have over the past 20 years, with the unfurling of this giant American flag on that west side where that plane crashed into the building. That was really the beginning, the kickoff of the ceremonies here. Next up will be an observance ceremony with the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, who will be coming to the Pentagon to that 9/11 memorial for a ceremony there. This will be an observance ceremony where the President of the United States, Joe Biden, will not be because, of course, he is in New York. But the President of the United States will be making his way through all of those three sites, and he will be here in Virginia at the Pentagon later on this afternoon for a wreath-laying ceremony. He will be joined by the First Lady of the United States, as well as the Vice President, Kamala Harris, and her husband for that very private wreath-laying ceremony, because the president said that he felt it was very important to actually visit those three sites. We won't be hearing from him today because, of course, he had that message, that video message that was put out by the White House yesterday.
And we've been hearing, Kethevane, pressure on Joe Biden. We heard it earlier with that former New York City police detective Bill Ryan saying that the U.S. Should not have completely left Afghanistan, that it was the wrong decision. We've also heard it from victims' families saying they want more information declassified about September 11th. He's promised to do so in batches. When I say the U.S. president's under pressure, just how much pressure this September 11th?
He's under extreme pressure, and part of it is a little bit of his own doing, and part of it is simply the situation. You mentioned, of course, those victims' families who have been asking for the declassification of some of the investigations into what happened during September 11th. And they had written a letter earlier on this year to the White House saying if the president doesn't follow through with one of his pledges, which was to declassify those elements that can be declassified, well, they felt that he would not be welcome on Ground Zero on 9/11 for those ceremonies. The Department of Justice had said over the months that they were working on looking through those pieces of information to see what they could declassify. The president putting a little bit of pressure on the Department of Justice because he issued recently an order saying that he wanted those elements to be declassified very quickly over the next 6 months, something that some victims' families thought was a very good step, and they felt that Joe Biden was finally living up to his pledge to help them out. When I say that some of the pressure is his own doing, remember that the pullout from Afghanistan, the deadline, the initial deadline that Joe Biden set for himself was September 11th, was today. When he first announced that pullout, that was the date. He said all troops would be out by September 11th. So the president himself wanted to use the symbolic 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, which of course triggered the war in Afghanistan, as also the day to mark the end of America's longest war. Of course, that deadline changed, and we all know how that pullout eventually took place. The chaotic scenes of evacuation, those 13 U.S. service members who were killed in the attacks at the Kabul airport, and of course, the fact that the Taliban are back in control of Afghanistan. So this has put a lot of pressure on Joe Biden because he made this date very symbolic, and he has of course, seen criticism from Republicans who have really jumped at the opportunity to attack the president on what they see as proof that he is not fit to be commander-in-chief. But he's also gotten criticism from Democrats, some who maybe agreed with the fact that the U.S. had to withdraw from Afghanistan, but who are very critical in how it was handled. And the sign of that is that congressional Democrats are going to be holding hearings in the coming weeks to figure out what happened, why the U.S. wasn't prepared, why they couldn't plan ahead and couldn't lead those evacuation in a more secure and orderly manner. And one of the first people who will be testifying in Congress will be the Secretary of State himself, Tony Blinken, testifying in front of a committee led by Democrats to explain what happened in that pullout.
One final question for you, Kethevane, and we'll be crossing over to you throughout when the ceremony begins, particularly at that precise moment where 20 years ago the plane hit the Pentagon. Here we've been talking about what the ritual is in New York City every September 11th. And in fact, I don't know if you can hear it, probably not behind me, but we're hearing bagpipes once again, which is a trademark at any New York City policeman or fireman's funeral to hear those bagpipes. What's the ritual, if you will, at the Pentagon and in the Washington area on a day like this?
Well, as I mentioned, the part of that ritual, of course, is that unfurling of the U.S. flag on that side of the Pentagon, the west side, where that plane struck. And the rituals or the ceremonies here at the Pentagon, of course, are influenced by the fact that this is the Department of Defense. You have soldiers, officers, generals here who have this very military-like ceremony, very solemn observance ceremony, very coded, and that's what we're going to be seeing with the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, and some members of this Pentagon. And later on, we'll have something a little bit different with the president when he will be visiting here. He will simply be laying a wreath here with the vice president. But really, in Washington, D.C., the ceremonies or the way people remember that day are very different and don't usually or always happen on September 11th. For example, Congress will be holding an observance ceremony, a sort of memorial for the lives lost across the country on 9/11. That will be taking place on Monday. The leadership of Congress, both Democrat and Republican, and members of Congress will be gathering at the United States Capitol to remember the dead of 9/11 because they feel that they survived a possible attacks. Because you have to remember that that third site that we both mentioned in Shanksville, that place where the plane crashed, where passengers took over the hijackers and crashed that plane was coming towards Washington, D.C. We'll never know exactly what the target was, but there is quite a widespread agreement on the fact that it was very likely the Capitol that would have been targeted by that plane. And therefore, a lot of congressmen and women who were in Congress already 20 years ago feel that they could have also been part of the victims. And so they remember also how these passengers from that flight that crashed in Shanksville probably maybe saved the lives of many people in Washington, D.C. And that's why you get these ceremonies, these remembrances very differently all across this town because, of course, Washington, D.C. is the nation's capital, and it was a target. It was the institutions of the United States that were targeted, with Washington, D.C. being targeted.